John Mark Walker from Red Hat is going to come in and introduce our panelists so we can hear about what the open cloud is going to look like. Welcome.
Greetings, welcome to Cloud Open. I'd like to introduce my esteemed panelists now. Wow, nice things. So, we're here to talk about the open cloud. My name is John Mark Welker. I'm the co-founder, I was the co-founder of GeekPack and the Open Cloud Initiative, and I do a thing or two for Red Hat these days. When I think of the open cloud, I think of open data and open services. And people work open data as they're wrapped inside open services. And when I started co-founded GeekPack in 2008, it was all about defining information rights and your access to data. And interestingly enough, later on, when we were forming the Open Cloud Initiative, I found that I was using the same arguments and making the same things. It's about open access, open data, defining access points and interfaces. And the great perversity of all this is that I don't think there's any argument anymore that open source is very much driving the cloud, and in fact has made possible businesses that couldn't exist otherwise. But the question is open source enough? Is open source enough to allow these services to be open? Like I said, the great perversity is people are using this open source software to create services that lock out people or lock you in and prevent you from moving somewhere else. And so I think the question that we don't answer is, what is the open cloud? What is it comprised of? And how do we work together to make sure that it remains open for everyone? And so I'll allow my panelists to introduce themselves, and they can also answer their perspective of what is the open cloud. We'll start with Greg.
We'll start with me. So my name is Greg Königsberg. I'm the VP of Community for Eucalyptus Systems. We are a infrastructure as a service vendor, and we have software that allows you to make your own cloud, as many people here have. Asking for a definition of the open cloud in a minute is compressing a very big set of questions into a very small space. You know, and sort of the way I think of it conceptually is fighting to maintain openness in a space that mitigates strongly against it at every opportunity. There's so much incentive for cloud providers to restrict, to make sure that you are using their infrastructure and their services and their everything magical and special. And one of the reasons that I came to Eucalyptus, I was at Red Hat for many years before, was that I liked the Eucalyptus idea of providing a choice for those users who have to some degree already drunk the cloud Kool-Aid. We focus on providing infrastructure that's highly compatible with Amazon Web Services, because that's where most of the innovation in the public cloud space is happening right now. And I very much like the idea of making sure that users of Amazon Web Services have a place to go for whatever reason if they need to move to their own infrastructure for any reason. And that means not just portability. And a lot of these things are obvious. They're table stakes. In order to do this, you must be open source. It's a given. It's not even an interesting discussion anymore. You must have a good understanding of the portability of APIs, and beyond that, you must also have a sense of portability of your entire practice, how you use the cloud. And I think that the open cloud, as the idea evolves, is going to tie all of that together in ways that I think we're now just starting to talk about in a structured way and figure out. And that's the cool part. We get to figure this out now.
I'm Stefano Maffulli, and I'm the community manager of OpenStack. OpenStack has been defined in many ways, from ranging from the amount of developers that it has, one of the largest open source projects out there, the fastest growing. But what I like to mention is it's infrastructure as a service. It provides the basic building blocks for you to replicate what infrastructure as a service is in the Amazon terms. So to me, open cloud, like you were mentioning, it's a new term. It's something that we need to be building as an industry. We need to start thinking about it. And what I like to start from is from the basic principle that I've been guiding open source since the beginning, since the 80s. And the principles were always about giving users their freedom to do whatever they need with their own software, with their own tool to enable their business or to enable their activities. And therefore, my way of thinking of open cloud is to start from that, start from the rights for all the users to have to move their data around, to enable their business, to enable their activities, to do things that proprietary solutions would not allow. So that's the basic building block. On top of that, we will have the conversation about writing it down into rules, writing it down in something that looks like the open source definition with all the 10 topics, 10 steps.
That's a great idea. Sam Ramsey, I have the privilege of serving with John Mark Walker on the board of the Open Cloud Initiative, where we try to follow the leadership of the OSI in writing down open source principles, instead drawing from the community what are the open cloud principles. And we identified 4, which we'll probably talk about in a bit. Also on the board of the Matterport Foundation, which is trying to advance the corporate contribution to open source. And I'm VP of Strategy for Apigee, which is a HTTP API platform. I tend to simplify things. I really like my friend Stefano here, who draws inspiration from Tron. He fights for the users. Starting from the user perspective, I think about 2 key things. One is, what are the user's rights to be able to move their data around? And immediately after that, you have to think about how does that happen? So that's interoperability. So user rights and interoperability, I think, are the key components that will make an open cloud. I'll sort of cross swords with Greg for a moment and say, open source is part of most sensible infrastructures, but it's actually irrelevant for an open cloud. Whether it does or doesn't have 100% open source doesn't matter in calling something an open cloud. What matters is, do the users have the rights they need? Are they aware of those rights, and do they have the capability to have interoperable data and applications that can draw out whatever content they put in the system and take their business elsewhere should they choose to break off their agreements with a given cloud provider, which I think is what the original 4 software freedoms were about. Should the provider of the software go out of business, the customer will not be harmed. So how do we, to use words of Simon Phipps, how do we reflect those 4 freedoms on the cloud? To me, that comes back to user rights and interoperability.
My name is Joe Brockmeyer. I'm one of the newest members on the community team for Citrix Cloud Stack's community team, and also a committer on Apache Cloud Stack incubating project. So I tend to agree a lot with Red Hat's Scott Crenshaw. I think his definition of an open cloud is 7 tenets everywhere from open API, open ability to deploy on your infrastructure, open source, open community. One of the things that I think gets confused when you're talking about open cloud is you have your software as a service cloud all the way down to the infrastructure. I'm on the infrastructure layer, so it matters very much to me that the source is open and people have the ability not only to move their data, but actually manage and change the way the cloud works and add different backends and do things. For example, CloudStack's Apache project or incubating project is getting contributions to work with different data stores and things that if the source weren't open and the community weren't open, that maybe a provider that wasn't preferred by Citrix wouldn't have the ability. I'm not saying Citrix would block them, but in theory, a single vendor that controls even source code can say, no, we don't want to play games with this particular provider. So I think it matters very much that the source is open and that even the community is open to as many participants as can bring viable patches.
It's one thing to control data when, back in the 90s when everything existed on a global box and computing was basically limited to this thing, beside your feet on your desk. And in that scenario, open source was enough. You didn't have to worry about the portions of it. In fact, it sort of hid the vulnerability of data because it was localized to you. As we move forward, because everything exists in the network or in the cloud or in someone else's data center, how do you actually, how does that change everything? And I think the question we have to ask is, what rights and freedoms are we able to expect in the cloud? It's one thing to say that, I control my data, but the fact is, data in aggregate and data in context can take on different meanings depending on where it is and how it's utilized. And so I don't think it's fair to expect that your data won't be used. I mean, the question then becomes, what is reasonable expectations and how do we define that? Who wants to take it? He says, looking at Greg, what are the rights and freedoms that we can reasonably expect in the cloud?
You don't expect any rights at all. You get the rights you. Here's the thing: the cloud, is providing enormous utility to people right now, and it's sort of it's naive not to expect people to use as much of that as they possibly can. And people tend to be sort of short-sighted, right? I'm going to use this awesome service because it works for me today, and the price is reasonable today, and it fits my business needs today. And if tomorrow they double the price and change the terms of service, I guess I'm in trouble, right? And I guess it's part of our job, and we were talking about this earlier. It's our job to sort of point out what the alternatives are at every level of the cloud, from the very base infrastructure all the way to the highest services.
What about the scenario where there is no alternative?
Well, that's a good question.
Then you build it.
We build it.
It's imperative. That's why CloudStack and Eucalyptus and OpenStack exist, is because it's imperative on the community. It's not up to providers who just go through their business model and say, now, is this appropriate for the user at every step? The user has to take some responsibility, and the community has to take some responsibility.
So the service provider has no obligation?
I didn't say that. I said it is not entirely their obligation. A lot of people like to ascribe kind of nefarious motives to cloud providers, like, oh, they're trying to lock up your data. Maybe that's true, or maybe they're just moving as fast as they possibly can to add features that's an afterthought. And maybe it's actually up to users to demand certain rights, and it's up to the community to build software that gives them an alternative.
It's definitely necessary to demand the rights that you want, right? I think that unsafe at any speed here applies to most of the cloud services that we use today, right? What are your rights relative to your data in Salesforce? Those are much less obvious than what are your rights to your data within AWS. In terms of what do we need to demand, I think that's an interesting question. So I think we need to demand that there be no discrimination on who can use the service. I think we need to demand that there are no unreasonable barriers to entry or exit. And those are going to be very hard to gain. Lock-in is the core nature of most successful businesses. So cloud providers, as Greg said, enjoy a set of perverse incentives that don't help them want to invest in interoperability. And interoperability takes two key forms from what we've seen in the cloud that are distinct. One is the open formats and protocols, which the open source movement did a huge amount to fight for and win. The second is something that Tom Hughes Croucher, ex-Yahoo, is fighting for, and he's developed a project called cloud-peering.org, cloud-peering, which shows you the technical infrastructure that most people don't understand underneath the software. So I think Jim is partly right when he says it's all about software value, but he's partly wrong. Those of us who fail to understand the nature of the network will be doomed to lose our rights. It will take longer than the heat death of the universe to move the terabyte of data that you have in one cloud provider to another. That is effectively lock-in. So we need to be aware of what we're demanding.
That's just
no barriers to entry or exit, and from the user rights perspective also, no discrimination.
There's definitely responsibility on our part as a community, as an open source community, as an educated community, to keep thinking about this and push these discussions outside into our companies as users and companies as providers. I believe that's our job.
That's because you're a big guy.
Yeah, definitely.
But the world is not fully big guys, right?
Well,
it's full of people following the incentives.
And that is something that we need to fix. And that is something that we need to fix. I mean, in the long run, I think that good companies, good people make good companies that make
have the investors as the shareholders.
It should be the rule.
So if you're going to push back and say that
Apple has the happiest shareholders of all. And
Yeah, but they're evil.
exactly.
we need to fix that. So Joe, if you're going to put the responsibility on the user and say it's up to them to act responsibly, I'm going to have to push back and say that individual actors have very little leverage when you're dealing with very large service providers.
And again, I'm saying it's not solely any one party's responsibility. It's not the user's sole responsibility. It's not the provider's sole responsibility. It's not the community's sole responsibility. It's a joint effort. But you cannot passively just say, we demand Amazon provide this and hope that they do the right thing, because that is just elective failure.
I'm saying some service providers have our heads over a barrel. The ultimate point.
Then you have to build the alternative. You cannot count on just demanding that the provider do the right thing.
So far we've been focusing on sort of like the public cloud aspect of, your services are hosted, offshore, some data center in the sky, some other companies managing it. What about the case where, when you said, okay, build it yourself, does that mean we should all have private clouds? What role does that play?
Yes.
I'm a big fan.
Yes. I know
Sorry.
what you're trying to say in every cause, that is the user's position.
Who doesn't have a private cloud in their living room?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Is there a serious question?
What role does the private cloud play? Does it change the dynamic at all? Is that the great equalizer?
Well, public clouds enjoy tremendous leverage because of scale, right? Amazon can buy hardware like nobody's business, and they can make all that hardware available in cheap ways to end users. That's awesome. But I can speak from the perspective of what Eucalyptus customers are asking for. And it's very clear what the users want. The users want the option to have a place to pull their data back to when US East goes down in flames for a couple of hours, right? Not that happens all the time, but when it happens, users want choice. They want the ability to assess the pricing out there and then say, we've got legacy hardware that we can pull into a cloud and we can do a better job for ourselves. But it's all about business objectives, but it's about having the choice to manage those business objectives in the way that the customer sees fit.
But at that level, the cloud is not very open right now, right? So my company runs on DataPipe, it runs on Amazon, it runs on some Rackspace services. But those are different worlds. It's incredibly hard to manage across those, right? There's perfectly good businesses starting and evolving, and Stratus around managing across the clouds, let alone trying to manage their deployment. It's a pain in the rear. It's really, really not good.
Right.
That's not a level of format compatibility. That's not the level of interoperability, even at the infrastructure layer, that I as a user would like to see personally. I don't know what you guys think. If you're finding it super easy to deploy and operate to multiple clouds.
It's definitely something that needs to evolve. It needs to. What surprises me is that we keep talking about the public cloud like we got this perception that everybody is on it, and sometimes just stop and think about the fact that for every Netflix there are thousands or millions of other companies that don't have anything running on the public cloud at all. They wouldn't because of privacy concerns, because of industry regulations. They can't. So the question of a private cloud is definitely something that is needed. We need to have portability across all of it. We need to build all of that. And it's young. It's a young industry. We're shaping it right now.
When I think of systems that work together well, I think of systems that have checks and balances. And so I look at private clouds as a check against public cloud. I look at a way to thank you. I look at a way to, again, public. In the past, open source was a check against, proprietary formats and proprietary software. Just like now, open data, open formats, open interfaces are a check against service providers doing nasty things with our data and services. But if you're a developer now and you want to create a new service, and you come across someone like Sam who says it's got to be portable, you've got to have services open. Does that dissuade you from creating this new service based on the cloud and from creating a company around it? Is it a disincentive for people to start new businesses, the entrepreneurs in the world?
I think we follow the economic reward and just deploy to AWS first, and then we ask other questions afterwards. But there's a certain economic justice component, right? When we don't have much money, we follow the path of least resistance. To make the comparison, the energy grid, right? I could generate my own electricity, right? I could have a private grid generated by whatever, solar panels on my house. I don't. That's too expensive for me, right? And similarly, like it makes no sense for my company to run its own private cloud as a startup, despite the fact that we have like 250 people and 10 Fortune 100 customers, or 20 Fortune 100 customers. The economics still point very, very hard at the biggest, best known, lowest cost provider. Now the good news for users is we know that when you actually do win the war and establish a monopoly, your reward is a DOJ inquiry. So there's some long-term check and balance.
And we know how effective that is.
But it takes 10 years, right? So the question is, what are users going to demand now, right? And how are we going to make sure that the cloud opens up the way that we like, rather than ending up, as you said, this sort of hegemonic, near balkanization of different 26 cent words.
Demand.
Well, I think they've already demanded open cloud. I mean, I don't think they waited as long as they did the first time.
And that's really interesting. Is if you look at the time scale that this industry has moved in compared to how long it took Linux to move from first idea of some student somewhere in Finland to full-blown industry, you're talking a period of 20 years. And when you come from 10 years to sort of pseudo-maturity, right? And that pseudo-maturity is we sell a hat and give you the distro for free. Okay? And then maybe another 10 years to full actual maturity where we've got $1 billion business basically.
I don't know who you're talking about.
I think you know who I'm talking about.
It's Debian, right?
It's Debian. The Debian path. No. And in the cloud space, it's been 4 years, 5 years, and I think that it is the experience that the whole world has of the success of open source that has provided a model that did not exist before. And now everyone can successfully follow that model into a space where, barely 5 years in, we're already talking, we've got this gigantic, lovely conference, thank you so much, organizers, where we're talking about issues like the open cloud. We've got vendors who are duking it out to have a solid
On
position.
stage.
Well, let's explore the model a little bit, right? So Eucalyptus, you guys do a really nice job of interoperability, and I'd argue that was one of the key things that helped Linux gain market share and gain contribution adoption, right? So if you look at the guys who built the Samba project, that interoperability with sort of Microsoft's dominance of departmental file servers allowed a huge amount of that usage, right, to shift over to Linux-based systems. That's only one part of the story of Linux. But interoperability was absolutely part of how that got there. You guys provide that, right? You guys mostly don't. Well, right? You're starting to do some AWS compatibility and stuff like that. But in terms of where you've come from, Joe, how much of interoperability is your model based on?
A fair amount, actually. Well, I mean, it's not entirely based on that, but the Cloud Bridge stuff that's now merged into Apache Cloud Stack, being part of 4.0, is pretty mature. It's still got work to do, but it's getting there. And, so that's part of our model, but we don't entirely depend on. By the way, I speak only for the open source stuff. My job entails zero revenue responsibilities, and that's the way I like it.
That's why we trust you.
Community.
So, we also are there for people who want to build private clouds to move legacy workloads over. We're also there for providers like Contigix in St. Louis that want to provide their own public cloud as an alternative to Amazon, whether or not people are using that layer. So,
Well, the same goes with OpenStack. I mean, there are some of the adopters of OpenStack that build products on top of it, try to downplay the compatibility with Amazon, especially because of competitive reasons. The code is up there. The code, the full support for either both S3 and AWS is in there, and it's part of. I mean, a lot of companies use it, so we need to provide.
Hasn't there been some deprecated? Wasn't there a decision to say we're not going to track?
No,
there was discussion.
that was a discussion, but no.
Some things look like decisions and aren't actually
There are
decisions.
plenty of companies that are part of OpenStack among the 200. that
So
we
are there
perform.
currently developers right now maintaining AWS compatibility?
Yep.
So we've got 3 infrastructure as a service guys up here who work for companies that create software. When you look at the apps and services built on top of the tools you provide, do they have an obligation to be open source? What role should open source play in building the apps that sit on top of what you guys do?
No one has any obligation of any kind. Yeah, I think we need to come back to this again and again and understand it. Nobody has an obligation to write open source, right? They need to, what we need to do collectively is put people in a position where open source is the only sensible choice, right? So right now, I think we are rapidly closing, VMware announced yesterday with their Cinderella project, they're going to provide compatibility for AWS level services, right? So VMware is certainly fighting to maintain their position in that infrastructure layer.
But does it still look like AWS after midnight?
It's a good question. There's certainly
Turns into
I guess Pumpkin is the next project that comes after Cinderella. I don't know, or Little White Mouse or something. Where was I?
I'm so sorry. I believe you're saying
I had a really good point.
I believe
there.
you're saying that nobody has any obligation to create open source.
I've got a glass slipper that fits me. No. Right, and so what we're doing as infrastructure providers is fighting to give those choices and make those choices compelling. And I think we're going to continue to move up and one of the things that we're doing at Eucalyptus right now is looking for the best open PaaS players to be competitive, to collaborate with, so that we can create a legitimate choice for people who are making PaaS choices. And I think that we're going to have to continue to sort of expand and move that fight up the stack. And create strength wherever we can, right? Solidify the infrastructure level, move to the platform level, move to the software as a service level.
So because you provide freedom of choice at the infrastructure layer, that will push things up the stack, so to speak.
I think it will. I think ultimately it will.
Okay. But the same thing didn't really happen in the sort of open source on the box. Linux has been open source for a long time, but not all the apps are open source. And
Not
all of it, but
Not all, but look at what people are choosing these days to
Yeah.
do. They're choosing the NoSQL databases that are almost all open source. They're choosing things that open source does well. And that's because things like Hadoop have been able to iterate on top of open source. So if you don't have an open source foundation, it's really hard to.
Yeah, and when you say that not everyone is making those choices, I think that's true. But the companies that matter are, look at Google, look at Amazon, look at what they're built on, look at where all of the guys I used to work with at Red Hat ended up taking their expertise, when they aged out of their Red Hat days and decided to go somewhere else.
Are you calling
What's that?
Are you calling it old?
I'm calling all of us old.
Okay, I'm sure. So the
They
economic
gave us
drivers.
skateboards, by the way. Just the organizers
Yeah.
gave us skateboards for speaking. I'm 43 years old, people.
And I am, for several reasons, taking special care of my knees, so that was kind of an insensitive gift for the Citrix guys.
I felt really cool for like 15 seconds, then I remembered, oh yeah, I don't skateboard.
And then I realized I'm going to fall backwards and kill myself.
But my daughter does.
Yeah. I stepped on it for a second, I said no.
So I want to raise the issue around interoperability and APIs. I mean, one of the things that I really worry about as a user is how much are all of us standing up for the rights represented by network APIs. Right? We had a near miss as a community in Oracle View. Right? There was almost a train that crashed through our beautiful open building.
Yeah.
So what are we doing to make sure
that will be a necessary event to really spur people into action?
Well, so I don't know. So nobody got really upset when Wine, right? Wine is not an emulator, didn't really get much market share because Microsoft kept scaring them, and they couldn't scare them on the API front, right? Because that wasn't subject to the same copyright laws. But they did scare them based on, we have patents on the implementation of the API, and if you implement that API, we're going to be able to get you. So when I think about the 4 components of IP law, when I think like copyrights, trademark, trade secret, and patents, I wonder which parts of those are going to ultimately be used to lock down the cloud and make it less open. So hopefully, at the very least, we can continue to underscore the need for APIs to not be subject to copyright law, that Amazon's good behavior that's happened so far will continue to be demonstrated by every cloud provider. I think if we don't, then we end up with a very non-open cloud.
Or perhaps it's up to some of Amazon's larger customers to say, we want clarity on this, and you need to state publicly that you are we're not going to pursue this.
And the stronger the open source penetration becomes in these large customers, the more leverage they have to make sure, because, I mean, there comes a time when making a decision against open source becomes bad for your business. And I think we're starting to get to that point where we can, legitimately make that case, and the largest customers will make that case for us.
Yeah.
You're exactly right.
So final word, in 5 years, every layer of the cloud stack is going to be open source.
Well,
Every
already
layer of
is.
the cloud stack.
When?
Nice big twist there.
I don't know that we'll ever see a future where everything is open source, but components at every layer will be, there will be alternatives at every layer in 5 years that are open source. I think that's absolutely true.
Sorry.
We'll try to go in order. He's familiar. I think there'll be open source modules at every layer, and that gives me a lot of hope. But I'm not sure that it's going to matter, because if the data is not open, then the users won't have the rights they need.
Stefano, quickly.
I'm seeing a trend, and I think I'm seeing a trend into open source being the de facto choice when you need to start a new thing, and you need to follow a competitor, or you need to follow up on some threat that comes from the outside. So I believe that in the long run, very long run, everything will be open source.
New businesses start closed because they can fence off an area and make some money. The second they prove market viability, the open followers come in and say, hey, let's commoditize this away so you don't make quite so much money, and we can share that value a little more broadly.
Ditto what he said, but I think there needs to be an extra component where there's an organization designed to protect the layers of the cloud and prevent companies from reaching monopoly status and taking advantage of it. I think we're being pulled off stage. Thank you.